Muy buenas. En estos momentos seguimos vigilando de cerca las distintas mesas de debate que están girando en torno al Foro Económico Mundial. En Davos en estos momentos está hablando Paolo Gentiloni, que por cierto también le acompaña el exgobernador del Banco de Inglaterra, Mark Carney. Vamos a ver qué es lo que pueden comentar en estos momentos. Están hablando sobre todo de un pivot a la resiliencia, hasta qué punto ese coste merece la pena. Escuchamos.
One of the lessons of the financial crisis remains to be seen with these other shocks. But one of the lessons of financial crises has been that you don't just lose the level of GDP, that you get the shock, goes down in the recession, then it starts growing again. But it doesn't necessarily grow in parallel. In fact, the experience of a number of countries has been that the trend level of GDP growth has been lower following a financial crisis. So it's a curse that keeps on taking, if you will, and that leads to things such as these debt buildups. So the cost of undervaluing resilience is very large. So what's happening, and we'll explore, I'm sure, in the discussion, is what is the nature of the response. And I'd suggest there's two high-level types of response. One is to embed resilience in companies. So in the financial crisis, post-financial crisis, a number of the reforms were effectively to have the banks, I'll simplify it to the banks, carry more capital and liquidity. So they had more resilience themselves. And so when these other shocks came, there were other factors, but in effect, when these other shocks came, they had greater cushions to absorb them, and they continued to function, and they were not part of the problem. I'd argue they might have been a bit of the solution. So some of the question is, to what extent do you embed greater resilience in companies? And we've got two leading CEOs, chairs, to provide that perspective. And then the other element is, well, to what extent do you embed it in the system? Healthcare systems, defense systems as well. I'll just finish up with two other broad points. One is some of the other macro implications of this. The way I look at it is that these are a series of costs that are incurred. They're in effect insurance premia. They're paid either by companies or governments. But that means costs that flow through the system. And as we build back resilience, we'll see these costs over time. And if we remember that we need resilience, we're going to continue to incur similar costs over time. So that provides a bit of a upward pressure on prices and moves us out of what has been a downward pressure on prices globally. It can be dealt with. Inflation's a choice. Central banks can lean against that, but it's there. The second thing is that a lot of the expenditure that's necessary is capital expenditure. I mean, I'm sure we'll hear about supply chain resilience, think about spending on health and otherwise. And on a macro level, and particularly with the energy transition and sustainability, on a macro level, this is big enough, in my view, to move up equilibrium interest rates. I can't tell you by how much, I won't give false precision around it, but on the whole, it moves us further away from the challenge we had in the intervening period after the financial crisis. So that just gives a bit of a sketch of some of the macro issues. I'm sure we'll get into the real substance as you go through.
Absolutely. So you talked about the nature of the response. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of response. And I'm going to start with you, Leif, because of course, I mean, you were at the center, at the epicenter of this, of COVID. And what is the specific resilience needed for a pharmaceutical company? You can spend, $1 million, more than $1 million more, developing a new drug, only to see it failing, right, in late stage testing, or even once you've put it in the market, or because there's side effects, or because there's a better product out there, and therefore could be seen as wasted money. In that context, and also in the context of the fact that we now know there's going to be another pandemic, how do you build in resilience?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that one of the biggest lessons that we learned as a company from the pandemic, and you remember we made 3 billion doses for 180 countries worldwide.
They're in me now.
That's very good, and you look very dynamic and radiant, so that sounds very good. I think we needed to go to a new place. We actually ended up with Oxford University as academia. So I think a preparedness to go to places where you don't normally go to is certainly a part of resilience. And I think we learned that lesson. The other one, I think, was that going into the healthcare systems of 180 countries, we actually learned a lot about how different healthcare systems are around the world. And in order of magnitude, you can say between 5 and 15% of GDP of each country is spent on healthcare. So enormous amounts of money. If you look at from a population point of view and from a pharmaceutical industry point of view, a healthier population is a more resilient population. And the more we can do for preparedness at the population level, but even the more we can do in terms of early detection and even preventing disease is our money very, very well spent. And there are very good data to suggest that investment for healthcare systems to do prevention or early diagnostics and screening, early intervention, probably has a return on 1 on 8, so $8 return on $1 spent. And if you look at that, then I think if the more we can do to really look at healthcare systems as assets for investment, with a payback coming as we have invested, that's a very good way to look at building more resilient healthcare system, because it provides for a different handling of the costs. Right now, we have a situation where the healthcare systems in all countries basically are under very heavy stress. Some of that has to do with the money spent during the pandemic. Some of it has to do with the rollback of procedures and different interventions that could have been done during the pandemic, which wasn't done. So there's a backlog of it. That obviously means that there will be short-term pressure on all healthcare systems. But in the longer term, let's say 18 months or so from now, which is the long term when it comes to making medicines, as you were saying, 18 months or so from now, the healthcare systems of the world are going to have to come into a situation where we see health as an investment that we can invest in and thereby reducing costs for the future, rather than looking at it as only a cost.
We might come back to that with Paolo, with you, but Oscar, you all equally were at the center of the pandemic, obviously, in distribution, in getting these vaccines everywhere they needed to be. What did you learn from the pandemic, and what are the key things, therefore, to build resilience? Because of course, supply chains is the problem that has been at the root of some of the inflationary pressures that we're seeing.
Yeah. So maybe a few things. Well, one thing that we learned, because we often talk about the problems of supply chains, but I think just to build on the earlier point, at the same time, within that crisis, we have been able to do something incredible with supply chains by actually getting the vaccines to billions and billions of people. Not only develop the vaccine, but actually also physically get it to the patients in a very short period of time around the globe in the whole world. So to answer your question, the first thing learned from that is that the impossible is actually possible, because I remember sitting in forums.
And much quicker.
Because I was remembering sitting in forums where I said, guys, don't underestimate the complexity of the supply chain to get the vaccines once we have them to the patients. And I must say, I'm surprised on how well that actually was done. So that is a good sign of resilience. But so I would say the big learnings of in general of supply chains over the past 2.5 years is, to build on your earlier point, is that over the years we have gone too far in just in time. Right, and we've basically stripped out all the various elements of a total supply chain, all the various stock points, all the various reserves out of the supply chain. So the moment that it actually started to become a problem, being it the Suez Canal, being it the war, being it obviously the epidemic, it has clearly shown that we need to build more resilient supply chains. That's, I think, the big learning. And I must say, that's exactly what's happening today. Because resilience, you mentioned earlier, resilience comes at a cost. That's true. It comes at a cost, but resilience has also shown to be very much the competitive edge, because that's actually how you differentiate. Those companies that have been very resilient over the past 2 years are also the companies that have been able to get their products to their customers and have been able to benefit from it and fruit from it. So that's an important element. Which brings me then to the second point, is what do you see then happening today in supply chains, and what's making them more resilient? One element is first response to everybody is build up stock. So stock is being built throughout the supply chains. Second point, which in Davos has been talked about a lot, is obviously making sure that you don't depend anymore on one delivery point, one source point for any product that builds your products in the supply chain. whether you now call it China plus one, India plus one, whatever name you give it, it's all about making sure that you have several points where a product could come from, so you have alternative supply chains, so that you're resilient to anything that can happen around the globe, being it climate, being it a health issue, or being it a war. So that's something that you clearly see happening at the moment. Now, how do you assure that that doesn't become a major cost issue? That comes down to, because you can easily do this by building lots of stock, having a very complex supply chain, which will actually increase cost. But then it comes back to using data far better, using data analytics far better. Not only for us within the company or any company, but also throughout the supply chain, so that there's better sharing of data through the supply chain, so you can better optimize through the supply chain your stock levels. So not everybody is going to build stock throughout the chain, but you actually start to optimize and communicate that through that. So I would say, I'll stop here, can go on for another half hour, but I think that's both the learnings and from what I see that starts to happen and the learnings that our customers are taking at the moment.
But I'm just going to press you on one thing, which is that this world that you described on alternate supply chains, how does geopolitics play into it? It's not so easy to create alternate supply chains, as we have seen over the last year. It is often geopolitical tensions or closing down or the erecting of barriers prevents that. And we're seeing more of that sort of bringing.
Yeah, but I'd like to challenge you there. I don't think it prevents it, it's actually driving it at the moment. Because you need to have alternative sourcing points in your supply chain, because you can no longer depend on one country of source. Because of all the political events, you cannot depend. We've seen that in clear example in the automotive sector, where lots of stores came from that specific country that went into war, and then suddenly you needed to have alternatives for that. Now that's a big learning. You can't predict what's going to happen. The only thing that you know for sure is that you need to have a supply chain where you have alternatives, so that you can be resilient and actually respond fast to set up alternative channels.
Paolo, how does resilience risk being a Trojan horse for protectionism? Here in Davos this whole week, we've talked a lot about the US, the Biden administration's IRA, and how many have said it's essentially a protectionist act. In particular, many Europeans have. So what is Europe doing to put companies in the best position that they can to be resilient?
Yes, well, thank you. First of all, let me, what are we doing in Europe about something, resilience? I was asking myself and Alessandra Galloni, how long has this term been so popular, resilience? Well, it always existed, but it is only since a few years. I think, obviously, that this is because resilience is a reaction to the crisis that we had. So the financial crisis, and then the double black swan that we had with the pandemic and the war. How is Europe reacting? Let me mention 2 or 3 things that are not obvious and quite new in Brussels. First, the big program that we are using is called Recovery and Resilience Facility. So you see the term is there. And it's the 800 billion program of recovery of our economies. The social dimension, the inequality dimension, the healthcare system dimension is very important in this program. This is the first thing. The second thing is we are looking to strategic autonomy, a taboo in the European Union until a few years ago. At the point that when we had this discussion in Brussels, we concluded it with the term that was open strategic autonomy. So a sort of Brussels oxymoron for what we were meaning. And of course, strategic autonomy means not only and not mainly defense, also defense, but supply chains and what we are talking about here. We are working on this for the first time in the EU history. And third, the future-oriented investments and industrial policies. Also, this to have common industrial policies in some strategic sector is completely new, would have been impossible. Mark, before Brexit would have been completely impossible. Of course, this means that not that we are delegating to the European commissioners the industrial policies, but that we are discussing with member states, with stakeholders, with the industries, what are the main sectors where we are lagging behind, we have to catch up, and we have to put some common tools, both on state aid rules and on common funding. This is what we are working on. Let me only add one thing, Alessandra. When I think to this term, resilience, and to how we reacted in a resilient way to the stress test of these last 3 years, I think that first and foremost, resilience has been connected to democracy. I think that a democratic model is a resilient model. And I think that this was very clearly demonstrated during this crisis. And it is still the case. So you can have lengthy decision-making process, you can have a lot of mess in our conversation, but at the end of the day, after these 2 big crises in a row, we see that democracy is stronger. So maybe it's a little bit of propaganda, but I don't think so. Keep in mind always that your society will be resilient if democracy will be your model.
So this is an important point, but we're not going to go deep into it. I mean, it has raised issues of democracy. But I want to press you just on one thing, though. This all sounds great. But how much, for example, of the Next Gen EU funds have actually been applied? I mean, the criticism of corporate Europe vis-a-vis Brussels, and even of some, governments is, there is so much, but mainly of corporate Europe, is there so much red tape, and it's just Europe is slow. And I was at a dinner last night at which a U.S. I will just say somebody from the U.S. because it was Chatham House basically said, "Oh, you Europeans, you're complaining, but why don't you compete?" So, how much has actually been applied, and aren't European companies shackled by rules? I felt like Mark wanted to answer that too. So Paolo and then Mark, yes. And then I want to go to Pamela, who's actually going to sort of give you reality.
I would say yes and no. Yes, in general. And so among things that we have to change when we discuss on what we have to change to make Europe more competitive is exactly what you're saying. Procedures, red tape, lengthy of our procedures on state aid, for example. If you refer to our so-called Next Generation EU recovery plan, I think that a certain amount of conditionality is absolutely needed because it's the first experiment that we have of putting money in common, and we need to make to all our citizens clear, and to government clear, that this money has been spent in the direction that we have agreed. So this is a burden for the administrations. I don't think so much in this case for the private sector. There are other burdens and red tapes for sure in Europe. And mostly there are the different regimes in different countries that are the burden for the private sector. The fact that you have, I don't know if 27, but a lot of different systems you have to adapt. And what we call the capital markets union, blah, 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 is moving
slower than a snail.
Bravo.
Okay. So again, but I was a serious question, how much of it has been applied? Do you have a percentage-wise?
Well, everything that was planned until now has been applied.
Can you give us a
well, I don't know. I think
You can think about it and we'll come back.
no. I think it's 138 billion until the end of last year, and this year we are planning to deliver expenditure for more than this.
Got it. Pam, I'm coming to you in a second, but Mark, you look like you were about to,
Yeah, it was a tell.
as a European, as a
As a European, I
honorary
am a European,
European.
actually.
Oh, you are?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
oh.
Irish citizen. Yeah. So
Well,
there you
welcome,
go.
welcome.
Speaking as a European, I like to say following. Just a couple of quick things. One is, look, from a sustainability perspective, climate perspective, I like this competition because you have the Repower EU is very powerful set of measures already. Then we get the IRA. Now we're going to get, taking President von der Leyen's remarks here from the other day, we're going to get a response, European response to that. So kind of race for the top. So that's all very positive. But I go back to something that Paolo said a moment ago about, and it wasn't just, not so much the oxymoron, there's something to open strategic autonomy. And let's just juxtapose open strategic economy and friendshoring, another popular term. So who are the friends, and in what sense is there the friendshoring, and where can you rely? This is a fundamental question for resilience: is who can you rely under stress, and how do you build out these models? And so I have no expectation that there's going to be any change, knowing the U.S. legislative system to the IRA. And as I say, net, we're behind on climate, so it's a good thing because we'll get these responses probably in Canada, I would expect as well. But it is a real issue in terms of determining how we build resilience across friends, after all. And I would say that certainly the EU and the United States are friends. As are the Canadians. I'll throw the Canadians to also Canadian.
Pamela, I've sort of left you last because I would like to sort of bring it back after looking at companies and then EU to sort of a more global picture, which is, which countries globally do you think are the winners and losers of this shift from efficiency to resilience? And does everything we've been talking about actually open the prospect of a shift in influence towards other countries and away from those that are the currently the big players and to others? And if so, how?
Well, that wasn't in my notes, but okay.
Well, I have a second question for you, which then leads us back into the other conversation.
No, I was thinking about this whole resilience discussion, and let me just give you a preface. I come from an island state that's been destroyed by hurricanes more than once. And so the concept of resilience for us is not theoretical, and it's not new. I think most developing countries live resilience every single day. It's you wake up, you have to be resilient, whether it is in the context of healthcare, whether it's in the context of exports, whether it's in the context of debt. Resilience is a sine qua non for what we do. And so, I looked at the definition for resilience: capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties, which is, I think, where the developed world is. We need to push back, we need to get back. Where I think we're developing countries, is the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, elasticity. And so that is the key issue. How elastic are we, and how are we able to respond? And I think the issue of, moving from this efficiency to resilience, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I don't think it should be seen as opposing poles. I think that we need to re-examine how we determine what is economic success. Because I think the determination of economic success as efficiency and competitiveness, et cetera, has led us to where we are, which is not looking at the sustainability of what we're doing and building resilience into that economic success, still being efficient, but also taking into account what are the other issues that will allow us to maintain this economic success, this efficiency, et cetera. So, is it a zero-sum game? No, it isn't. And I think the great opportunity we have here is building that capacity to make that switch. or to make that transition to sustainability, to, you know, meeting the EU due diligence requirements, looking at the IRA, how do you actually help developing countries to meet these new requirements and not be at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the green transition, et cetera? And then the second issue is, you know, is there going to be a shift of influence in terms of other countries? Yes and no. Yes, there will be. I think the African Continental Free Trade Area is coming up. They're pushing a lot on onshoring, reshoring, but getting value addition and industrialization in Africa as opposed to extraction and leaving. So building sustainability into that and ensuring that it actually meets the long-term goals, you know, for climate change, et cetera. I'll stop there.
Well, I wanted, you often talk about, I mean, one of the things we're trying to get to, I mean, is, in fact, as Mark said at the beginning, is sort of the nature of the response, is the words he used. You know, you often talk about greening, digital, and empowering women as sort of three, you know, so costly, but not any more than would normally be done necessarily as sort of, call them quick wins. You know, so what is the one thing, therefore, that when the people on this panel go back to their, you know, to their companies, to their constituencies, and, you know, should do?
If I could wave a magic wand, which only happens in the movies, I think the main thing I would say to companies is this. You have 90% of the companies who supply to you are small. They're considered SMEs across the board within the supply chain. Help them actually become part of the decarbonization process. Help them meet the requirements, because that increases not only their competitiveness, but the ability for them to actually expand their employment pool. It allows them to upskill. It allows them to actually, you know, remain viable. So work with them as the lead firms. For example, what AstraZeneca, what you did was incredible, because it allowed developing countries to get AstraZeneca first when everybody else had locked us out. In the Caribbean and elsewhere, AstraZeneca got there. And so these are the kinds of things that are important. In terms of governments, I think it's really important, and the EU has been doing a lot of work on this, in terms of building capacity of governments as well, to change their policy framework, to enable the kinds of green investment, to enable us to meet the requirements. Because one of the other things is that, for example, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, you know, over 4,500 farmers were decertified because of their inability to meet these requirements. And if that continues, then we're talking about another major stressor in terms of food security, et cetera. So I think that would be my first.
Which are exemplary countries?
You want me to? I'm a UN employee. Which are exemplary countries? I would say, you know, the EU has been, and I'm not saying this because you're here, the EU has been really open and very responsive to the need to do this. The Nordic countries have also been very responsive on this. And I think those are important issues. We've been talking with the US. The US has been more inward looking for a while, but I think that there's also the recognition that there needs to be more engagement on the outside. And of course, you know, the UK has been involved, less so now, but previously, on the issue of greening. Korea has also come in and is doing a lot more work with us on sustainability issues and so on. So I think that there is a recognition that there has to be this engagement, because you're going to leave 3/4 of the world behind, and that won't be sustainable.
I mean, Mark, what would your answer be as to, you know, who are the leaders? What countries can you call out as exemplary?
Exemplary with respect,
Well, I was talking specifically about greening, but which made me immediately pass it to you, because obviously for your new role. But I think in general, as an example of the world that you sort of laid out at the beginning.
Look, okay, I think that there is, in the broad topic of resilience, I would say the UK actually, I mean, funnily enough, the UK in certain areas, in financial services, for example, I mean, the response after the crisis, not surprisingly, has been there. I would caution that not to repeat the mistakes of finance over history, which is success as an orphan, and all of a sudden you do the right things and you forget about what the protections have been put in place and how that's helped you. So I would be a little careful in terms of the evolution of that system. But the response, the UK response, including structural response on finance, was leading, and also with respect to sustainability, has been one amongst the leaders. I would say co with the EU, including last point, because I want to hear from the others. But one of the important things with resilience is institutions, and so one of the value that the UK has and helped lead is to have the Climate Change Commission, which basically marks the homework of the government in terms of the quality of the policy, shows the gap, and you get a response to that, which helps to build resilience. And we need to think about how we do that. I mean, a little commercial for the Bank of England. The the Financial Policy Committee is an institution that sits there every day and thinks about resilience, and that's an institution that helps on the finance side.
Like, one thing that I wanted to ask you, I know you've been taking notes, so we have other things, but in the IRA, if I'm not mistaken, there is, for the first time, the federal government is negotiating directly on drugs to cover older Americans, right? So basically, the US government is going to negotiate on prices on a select group of drugs. And I'm wondering whether you think this is a turning point. And you say, well, how is this related? Well, because we've been talking a little bit about the interplay between public and private. So I'm wondering if you could maybe use this example, if it's okay, to and tie it to what you were saying before about the need for pharmaceutical companies to be resilient.
Yeah, I think you can say, first of all, drug pricing is not a new issue in any way or form for the pharmaceutical industry in the US. It is at any election time, it's been a big issue. And of course, one of the reasons is that the Americans actually have, altogether, when you look at it from the outside, a fairly inefficient system. It does provide the absolute best pharmaceutical products and treatment for certain parts of the population, but it does that with a fair amount of, if you want to call it bureaucracy or middlemen or whatever, with that way. So I would say an unnecessarily costly system, and much can be gained, obviously, by negotiating with us. But we are about 15% of the total healthcare cost. The total healthcare cost is much, much bigger area. And that takes me a little into that resilience, I think. Negotiating prices, there is not a single country in the world that we don't negotiate prices in. And there's not a single country in the world that don't say we would like to buy medicines more cheaply. So that we're used to that. That's the way it goes. But as a consequence of the vaccine, we were actually building or making vaccines in 17 different countries around the world. And that what made it possible to go to a number of places that other companies could not go to. We probably had a request for 100 new factories from 100 new countries to build vaccine factories. Now, that would not be a more resilient system. So to build 100 new factories for the next pandemic will not be a more resilient system than the one we have. Now, is it a good resilient aspect to say no vaccine factories in Africa? Absolutely not. Should be a couple, but there should not be 50, and likewise out in Asia. So I think one area of resilience is a little of international cooperation to find ways where we can use regional hubs for critical resources, and vaccine is a good critical resource, but it's not the only one. You could look at it from many other parts of resource also, and make sure that even in a crisis, in a pandemic or another crisis, and we have climate crises ahead of us, I think we could identify them, some of them already, to be able to use at least regional resources in such a way. That actually requires international cooperation, international agreement, and agreements that can withstand crisis. And that's an area where I think we are underinvesting dramatically right now.
One area that we haven't touched upon, and then I do think we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, but Oscar, I wanted to ask you, you talk about the redesign of supply chains, but one thing we haven't talked about is the workforce, right? In particular, aging workforces, and, labor shortages, it's a key issue now. How much can technology mitigate this impact? And how are these inflationary pressures exacerbating the challenge, essentially, of finding workers globally?
Yeah, I think the whole
and keep it. I mean, this is a huge topic. There'd be a panel.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention this as a.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the people element, as you say, we could talk about. You could have another forum about that. But when we talk about the resilience element of it, what has proven to be very important is to make sure that we work on collaborative robotics, which is one thing which has a huge involvement, a huge development over the past period. Lots of investments gone in that direction, lots of very affordable solutions. And specifically, if you approach it as a collaborative robotics approach, it means that you make the work more interesting and more effective. It is actually what we've noticed is in all our facilities where we actually made those type of investments, the employee satisfaction ratio actually goes up. And the retention rate actually improves. So that's one element, but that obviously then comes because it also makes work more interesting, but it also makes sure that we then actually need to make sure we train people. You talked about aged, and make sure that we train people on the various age groups to be able to actually make that journey together with us. Because that's a very important element as well. And it's not rocket science, but it is about making sure that we engage, make people own this, and therefore we stay part of that. So I think with the overall labor scarcity on the one hand, and the other one, the aging of it, the more you keep the job interesting, the more you keep on investing in making the job more efficient and effective and more exciting, the more you can keep and grow people and keep them with you.
Just, Pamela, did you want to add something on this? Because I saw you nodding vigorously. And then, Paolo, just quickly, very synthesis on this. And then we'll just get a few questions from the audience.
No, I was just nodding because of the need for the upskilling. The need for us to, I was on another panel this morning, we were talking about the fact that, within the next 10 years, 5 years, the amount of people who will be working in digital spaces versus machines is almost going to be equal, which means that we also have to change the way we approach the job market and how we train people and what we train them for and how do we help the job market make the transition.
Yeah, and then on that we make very much specific programs where we identify what the deltas are and
right.
What is trainable,
exactly.
And for what do you need to have new people. And a lot is actually trainable, and it's the right investments to be made in the people we have. Yeah.
Paolo?
No, only to say that, of course, the labor market is a big issue now, because we always say, and rightly so, that despite the crisis, despite inflation, despite everything, the labor market is overall in good condition. Mm-hmm. And employment is very low, and even job vacancies are there. But this assessment should not hide the fact that the problem of skilling and upskilling will be one of the key issues for resilience in the coming years. Mm-hmm. And it is also connected for Europe to migration, of course, because aging population, upskilling, migrants.
You always bring me to topics that could be
The world is connected.
Yes, the world is connected indeed. Okay, I'm going to take two questions. If you could, or up to two questions, go ahead. And then, sorry, just so they can prepare. And then I'd like to do a real lightning round to end, and just to wrap up your thoughts. But maybe if you can think of one word, what is one synonym of resilience that you think is really, that you would use to really think about what it means. I work with words, so I always
one word. Right?
one word. Okay.
Hi, Mehreen Khan from The Times. I have a question for Mr. Carney and for the Commissioner. Mr. Carney, you were quite sanguine about the prospect of having maybe a subsidies race for green tech with the EU responding to the IRA, etc. Are you not worried about some of the downsides, particularly if countries are given carte blanche to spray money at sectors just to compete with what other jurisdictions are doing and maybe not reaping the benefits of the overall falling costs that should come from the IRA for everyone else? And the UK has stood on the sidelines of this debate, probably because it doesn't have the fiscal room. Would you encourage them to get involved? And then a question for the Commissioner. Is joint borrowing a prerequisite to have a common and effective response? And if I suspect your answer will be yes, why is the answer yes, given that the EU has actually given quite indirect benefits to lots of industries in the form of free carbon credits for a long time? We have an ETS system which generates quite lucrative revenues for governments. That is money that should be used and should probably have been used in hindsight to help this greening process and hasn't. So is there just a lot of money sloshing around which could be used in the subsidies race that doesn't necessarily require RRF 2.0?
Gosh, somebody who speaks faster than I do. It was impressive. Mark.
A couple things. I'm not fully going to accept your characterization of fiscal spending. Look, there are certain technologies, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, the build out of charging infrastructure, which are, I would suggest, well, certainly mission critical for addressing climate change, but fundamental building blocks, at least on the first two, of competitiveness, industrial competitiveness for major economies. At this stage, up until the IRA, Repower EU, a few other measures, the incentives, the carrots and stick combination for those technologies were not yet adequate, given the timelines with which they have to come forward. We're now getting into the zone where that is happening, and it has material consequences, positive consequences, in pulling forward the crossover dates for these technologies to become competitive, and therefore these economies to become more resilient. So I think there's much to commend about both Repower EU, to look at that, and the IRA. And I'll run out of time, so I'll just say that there's much to commend of many of the aspects of UK climate policy as well.
Paolo?
Well, I agree on the fact that these measures are overall positive. Also, the IRA has a very positive aspect, which is strengthening the greening of the American economy. What we have not to forget is that this crisis has an asymmetric impact in the economies of advanced areas. So Europe is more affected than US or Canada or Japan, and the emerging markets are much more affected than Europe. So it's not like COVID that was a symmetric crisis in all over the world. And this is why we have to work on competitiveness, not with an RRF2. I agree with your skepticism. We have to implement RRF, which is already a big, big thing, but identifying the missions, the targets where the scale and the added value to support things at European dimension is crucial. It's not everything. I'm not saying that national support schemes are useless, but if we want to catch up in some sectors where we are lagging behind, we need the scale of a market with 450 million people. And we need to concentrate also resources. But it's not a new RRF.
Great.
Not this dimension.
I'm going to close it here. Just last, I'm going to use this as your last remark, resilience. What's the word, that's a word or thing that comes to mind when you think resilience? One word.
Democracy.
Democracy.
Survival.
Survival. And did you have any closing remarks that you wanted?
I just think
Survival. Excellent. Officer?
Opportunity.
Opportunity. Mark?
Robust.
I would say science and technology. There is such a wave of new science coming our way, genetics, immune system, everything that has to do with genes and cells. That can be translated into really good medicines for the future and help alleviate healthcare costs.
Well, science is your word then. All right, thank you everyone. We've run out of time. Thank you so much
Thank
to my panelists. Really
Grazie.
Grazie.
Okay.